And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Tonight, let's call this part 19 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, tonight's episode of this ongoing series I have is going to be on the Ardeatine Massacre, which happened in the caves of Rome, in the hillsides of Rome in 1943. And it was a grand massacre by the Germans against Italian civilians. Now, uh, the Ardeatine Massacre is something that's not really highly known all that much because there was an attempt to conceal it by the Germans, but of course that didn't work. And in effect, in Italy, it's very well known. And this is a hard one because there's a lot of harsh language here. Now, what inspired this podcast tonight is going back to the last cast I did about historian Daryl Cooper, the reaction that he got from the social media and the far left ideologues that hammered him over the issue of a more nuanced view on Churchill and World War II and the German concentration camps. One of the things that Daryl Cooper did on his cast in trying to appease the narrative that was given that he was a Nazi sympathizer and an anti-Semite was actually cite the great crimes that the Germans committed on the Eastern Front against Jews. And there's some brutal stories, at least as he presents it. I want to make sort of a historical parallel with the Italians and what the Italians suffered through under the Germans after Mussolini is deposed, right? Because it shows you the Germans' willingness really to go after anybody that presented a challenge to their power. So it's 1943. I've told you guys about in this series about the king replacing Mussolini. Effectively, you got a fascist Grand Council that has a vote of no confidence against Mussolini. It gives not just legal, but moral authority for the king to replace Mussolini as the head of state. Well, the moment that happens, you have lots of problems because Mussolini's been in power in Italy now for 21 years. And in many ways, Mussolini did a lot of the jobs himself. He had very key positions that he headed himself. You have a nation that nobody knows how to really run at that point. And the king replaces Mussolini with General Badoglio. But Badoglio has never run a government before, especially a government now that's in the midst of a war. It turns other Germans. The king and Badoglio flee to the south to join the Allied side. And all of a sudden now, the army, at least, the army in Italy disintegrates. And the Germans, feeling that they had been betrayed by their allies, the Italians, then they turn their attention or their slaughter toward the Italians because they had betrayed the alliance. And Italian soldiers were immediately killed even as they were surrendering by the Germans. The Germans effectively had a policy in place similar to that what they had in Poland. And they were going to treat Italy like Poland, with only one exception. And that is, as Mussolini was put in charge of the Republic of Salo as a puppet leader of Salo. Now, there's a dispute whether Salo was a puppet government or not. To Mussolini, it was real. But I think for all intents and purposes, what we find out as we read, his power was very little. And I think the Ardeatine Massacre is a classic example of this that I believe Mussolini had very little power there. But as you know, as the events turn and the Italians are now viewed as traitors, Hitler begins to take out his vengeance for this betrayal. Mussolini, for his part, really struggled in many ways. from historian Richard Lamb, and that's who I'm going to be using here as a primary source. Richard Lamb, and the name of the book here is War in Italy, 1943 to 1945, A Brutal History. And Richard Lamb is interesting. If I remember correct, his biography, he was a Catholic British writer. I believe he fought in World War II, but on the German front of the war, not the Italian front of the war. And then he started to write history books about the war itself. And I find him interesting because he tries to be, even as an Englishman, as fair and objective as he can be. He doesn't treat Mussolini like Hitler, but he has great critiques of Mussolini at the same time, and in this book points out lots of Mussolini's mistakes. Now, I think there's some more nuance to how Richard Lamb presents some of these issues with Mussolini in Italy at that time. I think it's a little bit more complex, but it's still a good basis of a story. And I do believe Lamb is not trying to be an ideologue here, but rather try to be a true historian. And I'm willing to look at, myself objectively, all points of view. And it's possible that Richard Lamb's assertions about Mussolini could be right. I'm open to that. And so what you effectively have in 1943, again, Bagdaglio and the king are on the run. The Italian army in Italy disintegrates as they're surrendering now to the Germans. Even as they're surrendering, they're being lined up, they're being shot. The brutality is extended out to the civilians, Italian civilians in the north of Italy. The brutality is just, it's bad. It's bad. And like I said, they were treating the Italians now like they were the Polish. That's how bad it got. And it's, as Richard Lamb argues here, this is one of the more brutal parts of World War II that is never discussed. This is how vengeful the Germans were against the Italians. Now, in respect to, Mussolini, his role in this, it's a little complex because he's in the middle of something that he doesn't have a lot of control of, even though he does have some decision-making powers at Salo, but again, always surrounded by German power and the German military. Mussolini, as Richard Lamb notes in his book, tried to get 4 battalions raised again once he is sort of made the head of the Republic of Salo, but those units really disintegrated pretty fast. The morale of Italians was broken. And what effectively happened by 1943, the Battle of Africa is really where it was lost from Lamb's notes in this book. The loss in Tunis and the surrender of the Italian and the German generals at Tunis really broke the spirit and the willingness of the Italians to continue to fight. The Italians never wanted to be in this war. And I think in general, I think we could probably critique Mussolini here for getting Italy into this war. Yes, we could talk about the geopolitics and the betrayal of the British turning their back and pushing Italy away. We could talk about all that sort of diplomatic mess and point some fingers everywhere. But I think if there's one critique of Mussolini, is that he brought Italy to the end. It brought Italy to its end, his own end, ultimately his death, but also the destruction of Italy after the war. And then effectively, once he's ousted out of power, Italy was left at the mercy of the Western liberal republics and the communists after the war. And I think, again, we can debate the nuances of fascism and ultimately his dictatorship in Italy, and a lot of it which the Italians bought, granted through a lot of propaganda without a doubt, but still they bought it because it brought unity for the first time ever to Italy. But at the same time, it's a situation where the country suffered mightily and then it turned on Italy. Listen, by the time you get the loss at Tunis, the Italians felt that the war was over. They weren't willing to fight. And then you had issues of inflation that were kicking in, particularly in southern Italy after the invasion of Sicily. Well, I think the starvation of the southern Italians began before the 1943 invasion of Sicily. But once the Americans and the British got there and they took over Sicily pretty easily, pushing the Germans back onto the mainland of Italy and on the southern boot there, the inflation was so high that Italians were literally starving. A little bit different dynamic than in the North, where it's funny, they didn't face inflation like they did in the South and starvation, but they were left at the hands of the brutality of the Germans, something that the Southern Italians didn't face because that was part of the sort of armistice signed by the king and Badoglio to fight on the side of the Allies. And so the terms and conditions of that armistice are always very interesting because the king and Badoglio always wanted to keep Italy separate and didn't want to be seen as sort of an enemy of sorts that should be governed. But I think the British and the Americans were always going to make Italy subject to their own dictates, right? They were given some terms and conditions where, well, okay, if you guys fight hard enough, and prove yourselves, maybe we won't treat you like a defeated nation. Maybe we'll treat you like a victor because you turned. But there was always conditions on that. And my contention is this. I just think FDR in America wanted a foot in the door in all of Europe, and Italy was a prime spot. And I think we learned that later on with lots of American operations within Italy. And so I don't think the king and Badoglio were ever going to be given a fair shot. But that's me speculating there. But like I said, after the loss at Tunis, the Italians felt the war was over. They wanted out of the war, and thus began the brutality of the German army against the surrendering Italian army and even the civilians, which led to this grand event, the Ardeatine Massacre. Now, what was the Ardeatine Massacre? Well, there was a situation where Pope Pius XII at the time wanted Rome to be declared a free city for more. He wanted the Allies to agree to this, and he wanted the Germans to agree with this to try and avoid fighting within Rome and even Vatican City. But the Allies weren't going to let that go and declare Rome a free city. They were going to go in there with their guns ablazing and bombing everything, mainly because a lot of German supply lines ran through Rome, according to Richard Lamb. And so in the course of the war, as the Allies are coming up from the south, you have partisans that are in a mix. Now, who are the partisans? Partisans are Italian fighters that are against the fascist regime that ultimately aligned up against or allied with the Allies, and they were working within Italy behind the scenes, sort of trying to fight the fascists and the Germans and kind of stab them in the back or shoot them in the back and run guerrilla operations to assist the Allies. And half of the partisan groups, the one major partisan group, they were communists, they were Marxists, and they were brutal. They were brutal. In fact, Richard Lamb notes that the Marxist wing of the partisans were used just as brutal tactics in Italy as they did in the Soviet Union. Apparently, the other branch of the partisans were not Marxists, but they were, as Lamb calls them, Italian patriots trying to liberate Italy from the fascist regime. But the bottom line is they use guerrilla warfare and tactics. And where this comes into play is that there was communication between the partisans and the Allies. And what the Allies wanted was effectively for the partisans to sabotage the German posts. So the Allies would be attacking from the front, all the while the partisans would use guerrilla tactics in the back, trying to shoot the Germans in the back, so to speak, right? And it came to a point where the free city issue, it wasn't going to work, but the Germans were trying to make the point that they're in Rome and they had some flamboyant SS troops that would march through the city. Ultimately, And what happened was to kind of declare their occupation of Rome, that they kind of controlled it. Well, the partisans figured out sort of the roadmap of these SS units and where they would march, what time they would march, right? They had a plan in place. And ultimately, they set up a bomb on a road called Via Rosella, right in the middle of Rome. And I don't know how many tons of TNT that they used. And you had a battalion of SS soldiers, again, marching down the street. A lot of these soldiers, one of the reasons was to enforce criminal laws, and they were pretty brutal from Lamb's description of what the SS soldiers were doing. Again, the Germans were really persecuting the Italian citizens at the time. And as they're walking down Via Rosella, this bomb goes off and it kills 32 SS soldiers, German soldiers. And of course, this sparked outrage from um, Hitler. And the leader of the German military, Kesselring, in Italy. Kesselring was notoriously brutal, by the way. But Hitler, in sort of a reprisal on how to deal with a part of sort of the geographical territory Germany controlled, what do you do to suppress when you have these guerrillas attacking you effectively? We saw that in the Polish front. And again, I go back to Daryl Cooper, as he pointed out, the reprisals that were taken out against Jews in the Eastern Front happened after Bolsheviks bombed like a building or a station of some sort, and a bunch of soldiers died. That's where the Germans gathered the Jews up, walked them down to a giant pit, shot them, and in a mass grave. And it was pretty brutal from the description that Derek Cooper said in his sort of rebuttal to the mob that was going after him for his comments on Tucker Carlson's show. Well, here was kind of the same thing. The moment that bomb goes off on Via Rosella, Hitler wants revenge. And in order to suppress the guerrilla tactics, and he orders that for every German soldier that dies at the hands of partisan attacks, or really any Italians at that point, that 50 Italian civilians would be shot. In this case, it was 32, which meant a lot of Italians would be executed as a reprisal. Now, Hitler, with great difficulty, was talked down by some of his leadership from 50-1 down to 10-1, which meant for 32 German soldiers dead, it was 320 Italians had to die via execution. And what they try to do is go to the prisons and find 320 prisoners that were already scheduled to die, rather than just pulling innocent people off the streets. The problem was there's only 3 Italian citizens that were scheduled to die via of execution of some kind. And so they basically had to take prisoners of war who were not condemned to death, maybe of lesser crimes, and throw them into this 320 number in order to come up with a number to satisfy the demands of Hitler coming from Germany. And these were prisoners for, again, lower violation sorts. Some of them were suspected of having anti-German sentimentalities. Now, the other option was to try and find the partisans themselves who committed the crime. If they could have found those particular 16 partisans, I forgot which battalion it was, then you execute those. If you can't find those 16, the order was, then you take 10-1, you take 320 civilian Italians, and you have to execute them. So they can't get enough that are on death row. They pull Italian prisoners out of jail for lesser crimes. They're still about 10 short, and then they grab 10 Jewish Italians to get the 320 that they need. And and they start caravanning these prisoners up to the caves in the Ardeatine mountains there. And let me read this from Richard Lamb's book. I think he writes better than I can explain, and it'll give you an implication of what happened there and how serious these atrocities are. Now, just fair warning here. This is, it's a pretty heavy chapter where you're talking about the mass murder, the whole slaughter murder of a bunch of civilians, right? By midday on March 24th, a list of 320 prisoners have been drawn up for execution the same day. Staff officers of Malta headquarters refused to take responsibility for carrying out the atrocities, and Kapler was forced to use his own Gestapo. He had 12 officers and 61 men available. The Gestapo officers organized a mass execution in the large Ardeatine caves, which it was planned would be sealed off afterwards by German engineers. Another German soldier died of wounds received in the Via Rasella bombing, and on his own responsibility, Kapper coolly added 10 innocent Jews to the death list without consulting Kesselring. On March 24th, lorry after lorry brought Italians from the Regina Coeli prison to the Ardeatine caves. At the trials of his colleagues, Malzer and von Mackensen, Kapler gave evidence that with hands tied behind their backs, the victims were ordered to walk in and kneel. Then they were killed by a revolver shot through the neck. There were so many corpses that the last arrivals were forced to climb over the pile of the dead. Kapler gave evidence that after the massacre, he told his men to get drunk on brandy because they were so shocked but what they had done, and that he shot many Italians with his own hand to encourage the others to do the same. Hearing the cries of other victims before their own death added to the cruelty of the massacre. In an affidavit for Kesselring's trial, Kapler described in a matter-of-fact language how, in a companionable way, he led a German private by the arm into the cave where together they executed Italians. A strange example of German companionship. The matter-of-fact language makes the horror even more nauseating. It is clear the victims were given no opportunity to see a priest or make other arrangements. At about 1400 hours, the first transports began to move, and I and a number of men. Now, excuse me, let me preface this. He's quoting here, I believe he's quoting Kapler here. Okay. Yep. Kapler described in a matter of fact, right? So he's describing what Kapler's words are here after the war. Let me start again. At about 1400 hours, the first transports began to move, and I and a number of men went to the cave. As each truck arrived at the cave, the persons concerned, always 5 at a time, and each accompanied by SS men, were led to the end of the cave. All persons had their hands tied behind their backs. At the end of the cave, 5 were made to kneel down together, and at the given order, they were shot in the back of the head by an accompanying SS officers. After the execution of each 5, the 5 SS went to the exit, and in the meantime, another 5 SS brought in the next 5 victims. After I'd fired my shot, I went out and controlled the following: Prebix and the measures for cordoning the area. I then drove back to my headquarters and returned to the cave at about 1800 hours. I found on arrival the Hauptsturmführer Wotjan had not yet fired a shot. I spoke to him in a comradely manner and went into the cave with him to fire another shot at his side, and at the same time as he. I had not yet received Caruso's list and sent Obersturmführer Tunath to his office so that he could assist Caruso in speeding up the transport of the persons listed by Caruso himself. The execution was over at about 20-30 hours. I left the cave before the end of the executions at about 1900 hours. The measures, as much as I thought justified at the time, and still do so now, according to the laws of war, I have lately had doubts, end quote. And that really lays out the horror that it was. They said that the bodies were stacked up on top of one another as the victims were being walked in, and they were being forced to walk over other dead bodies, that they realized what was about to happen, the fear, the panic. Lamb records that there was one sheep herder out there that was, walking his flock out there, heard the screams, the gunshots, ran immediately to the church to grab the priest, and along with two other priests, ran to the cave themselves, and they found the dead, rotting corpses, the stench, and they gave a general absolution to all those that were dead. They went on later to report the matter to Pope Pius XII and what had happened. It's a dark and grisly history. They say that the German soldiers afterwards had to get liquored up because of what they had done, the guilt that they had done, in order to deal with it themselves. As you read there was some of the soldiers that were trying to avoid being part of that. Now, Caruso is interesting because he was an Italian, actually, that partook of this. There's two Italians that partook of this massacre. I think Caruso was like the head of the police force, I believe, or the secret police force in Italy. He was later, I believe, executed after the war for his crimes. And so, again, the Italians being vanquished off as a German enemy got really the same pound of flesh as all the other enemies of Germany time. And it goes to show you, what happens, not only in the state of war, but what a period it really was. Now, for Mussolini's part, when he heard about the massacres, he was horrified. And this is where, despite the criticism that Richard Lamb has of Mussolini, one of the things he does give Mussolini credit for in this case is that he says that Mussolini did his best to protect the Italian people when he was the head of Salo. In fact, after Mussolini was rescued from Mount Sasso, right, he wanted to go into retirement, but Hitler didn't, rescue or capture Mussolini off Mount Sasso for him to go and retire and be with his family, right? Because Mount Sasso, there's a debate: was Mussolini rescued or was Mussolini captured? Because Hitler had planned for Mussolini and then set him up as the puppet leader of Salo. But one of the reasons why Mussolini agreed to it is because he understood the brutal nature of the Germans, and he felt that he could be a buffer for the brutality of the Germans. Because the moment Mussolini is overthrown, the Italians now are enemies of Germany, and the brutality begins. And Mussolini thought that he could be that buffer to protect the Italian people. And to a certain degree, he did. I mean, I know with, for example, I think it was 7,000 Jews, 7,200 Jews that were captured by the German SS and an Italian SS that was set up by the Germans. Almost all of those Jews died in some camps. Only about 115 or 20 of them came back eventually after the war. When Mussolini figured out that Hitler was coming for the Italian Jews, he basically gave an order to his, I think, Minister of Interior to put out a radio message warning them to get out. But he couldn't stop them. He couldn't stop Hitler. And so one of the critiques here is that Mussolini eventually stopped pleading back to Berlin, back to Hitler, in order to stop some of these atrocities like the Ardeatine Massacre, because the more he pleaded, the more it was ignored, the more he felt like he was losing more and more power. He felt there was no need to appeal anymore. So Mussolini's response to the Ardeatine Massacre, rather than make another appeal to Hitler that would have been ignored, he ordered the release of all the non-murderous prisoners in Italy, right? All those that were not effectively on death row, right? All those that were in the prisons for lesser crimes, Mussolini ordered that all of them be released. So the Germans couldn't just go to all the prisons and continue to execute Italians. Mussolini ordered all of them to be released. And again, this is Mussolini doing what he can at the time, and mainly because the battalions that were formed under Mussolini, there was a couple of problems, right? Fascism now at this point had fallen from its grace. While it was very popular up until the war with Italians, now that the war was going bad and Italians were feeling hunger in their bellies, they were starving, well, the regime took the blame for getting them in this situation. And with that, the appeal of fascism begins to collapse, right? This is why people say Mussolini ran Italy fairly effectively until his decision to ally himself with Hitler, and that was his ruin, him and Italy for that matter. And I think that's probably a pretty accurate description. But you know, for Mussolini, he did whatever he could at that point. You know, as the head of state there, understanding. But as Richard Lamb notes in his book, Mussolini understood by 1943 the war was over. Could he manage some kind of a peaceful resolution with the Allies at that point? And that's where we get into the conspiracy of the Mussolini-Churchill papers and reaching out to the British, who the Italians always had a good relationship with up until that war, up until, again, the Ethiopian War and the politics involved there. And in many ways, from what I understand, Churchill, like Mussolini, wanted to treat Mussolini different than Hitler. It was Anthony Eden, the foreign minister, who Mussolini had rejected in 1935 over the Ethiopia affair, that wanted total and complete punishment for Italy. And that effectively ended an ability for Mussolini to negotiate a peace, a separate peace. Now, for Mussolini, the separate peace was always going to be problematic. Would he have done it? Because remember, there was a great insecurity about Mussolini, right? And you see this in Rochelle Mussolini's book, her autobiography on her husband, how she proudly proclaims how they always maintained their alliance with the Germans, right? They weren't going to break that alliance because there was a great insecurity for Italians. Remember, after World War I, they were considered traitors because they had flipped sides in the war. And that insecurity resonated in Mussolini's mind. And it's why when war was finally declared over Poland, Mussolini wasn't going to break that alliance, because the Italians were already called traitors after World War I. But I think the realization of losing the war and also the suffering of Italians, I think this is where I think a lot of people misunderstand Mussolini, who truly loved Italy, really cared about the Italian people, saw the suffering. And also, don't get me wrong, I'm not suggesting it was altruistic. I'm sure he was trying to look out for his own self-preservation. He always said that he was never going to be taken alive. He was not going to be made, have a show trial in London or New York. He always knew he was going to die, but maybe you could work out a stalemate. Maybe you could work out a kind of peace. He tried. and he tried to go through the Vatican at the end of it all as well too. But again, that wasn't going to work, and so here you have it. Here, one of the most brutal events in World War II. I don't even want to describe it to you guys. I read it to you guys. The horror of that event. Now in Italy, there's a monument there. There were some lawsuits afterwards, and the question was here, and this is the big debate about the Ardeatine Massacre, is who is to blame at the end of the day? Because when it went to Pope Pius XII, Pope Pius XII in the Vatican newspaper, was it called La Observatore, actually blamed the partisans for the crime. Richard Lamb finds that strange, right? In that it was his flock that was massacred. And the question of war is this, right? And I don't know how this plays out. I'm not a military guy. What are the rules of engagement when you're trying to suppress an uprising within the territory that you control? The Allies can communicate a message to the partisans to create guerrilla warfare and sabotage. The Allies attack from the front, the partisans attack from the rear, and you effectively surround or confuse or create lots of havoc for the Germans. The Germans take reprisals out on the civilians. The argument that the Vatican made was that if the partisans didn't carry out those attacks, it never would have came down to these massacres, right? And so from Lamb's perspective, he thinks the Pope is misguided here, that he stayed silent on the atrocities of the Germans, but he does acknowledge that Pope Pius XII took a diplomatic act, and at the advice of one of the, papal nuncios from Germany, saying if he stayed silent, less people would be, killed off or treated brutally by the Germans. And he took that approach of not rousing the buck. I don't know what the term is. And so when the Germans came for the Jewish population, the 7,000 roughly that were shipped off to the camps, and then ultimately the Ardeatine Massacre, he stayed silent, because if he spoke up at the time, he was convinced by, again, diplomatic channels, that this would be treated even more harshly by the Germans. And so he went in so far as actually to blame the partisans, which makes it look like that, Pope Pius XII is taking the side of the Nazis. Now, I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, what the diplomatic channels are. And so that'd be interesting to learn more about that. Of course, there's always been questions about the approach that the Vatican took in regards to, the Germans and the issue with the Jews. What I will say is this, is that one of the issues that's constantly brought up, and I believe Richard Lamb talks about this, is that the papacy, the Pope, the Vatican, were hiding hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews within the Vatican, within the monasteries and the convents. And if Rome, or the Vatican, I should say, would have aroused or upset the Germans, then the Germans would have went into the Vatican and effectively not only just found all the Jews that were in there, but effectively destroy the Vatican, take that down. There was concerns. And I think that was probably a pretty real concern, that any hyperbolic statements to condemn the Germans publicly would have led to even more deaths. I think that's a very reasonable assessment, considering how many Jews were being hidden within the ranks of the Catholic Church's properties. So the question is, do you come out and condemn the Ardeatine Massacre, even though that's your own people? I mean, if you want to be upset about the Jews that were taken away and he was silent, you want to criticize him for that, which he has been, fine, whatever that is. I think there's more nuance there. But if you want to equal the playing field of sorts, right? He didn't speak out when the Italians, like Richard Lamb says, his own flock was massacred as well. Why? Why? He didn't speak up in either case, either for the Jews or for the Italians. And that is, he was working through secret channels. He had lots of Jews hidden already. Yes, this massacre was terrible, but to rouse the buck or rouse everything up would mean that the Germans would storm through the doors of the Vatican, the convents, the monasteries, and more people would die. I mean, I think you could argue that Pope Pius XII had his hands tied. He had no choice but to dialogue with the Germans. I think also probably the other problem was that the partisans weren't exactly all wholesome either. They were Marxists and communists. And after the Bolsheviks had ran through all of the Christian communities, the monasteries, the churches in Russia, killed tens of thousands of priests and nuns, and destroyed 24,000 churches, there was no love for the partisans and the communists. At least he felt at least that he could kind of dialogue with the Germans, and he probably made his decision based upon what he thought was the lesser of the evils. But um, this is just one of those things in politics where you have to make your decisions, and for that, Pope Pius XII has gotten many critiques. A lot of it, I think, is Monday morning quarterback or armchair quarterbacking, whatever you want to call it, because the church was in a position where it spoke that would lead to more death. I know a lot of people will critique that that stance, but I don't think it's as black and white as to say, well, the church didn't care about the Jews. No, it's not right. I think obviously there's always been this contention historically between Jews and Catholics, but the wholesale murder of Jews, I don't believe the Vatican ever supported anything like that. It goes against the basic tenets of the faith and human dignity. And many of the papal documents have said that even though we have our disagreements with the Jews, they're to be respected and treated with human dignity. I just think it was a political calculation. And so there you have it. The mass murder of 320 Italians, and that's just in one event. That doesn't include, like I said, all the civilians that were killed, shot on the spot, curfew issues, right? The military that surrendered, shot on the spot by the Germans, being treated with great brutality. Like I said, Richard Lamb, War in Italy, 1943, 1945, brutal history. There's a bunch of other stuff on here too in this book, and I'll probably do separate segments out of this, because there's another incident that happened in the Aegean Islands. Once the Italians turned, there was another massacre of an entire Italian battalion in the Aegean Islands, where Italian soldiers were just executed one by one. I got to get more into detail. I did read this a couple years back, and I'll present that story. It's another brutal story of Germans murdering Italians. So the Italians really got it. And you could probably argue they deserved it. They got in that war. You could blame Mussolini without a doubt. I think it's fair. It's his decision to get in that war. And while I don't think that Mussolini is the villain that Hitler was, I think politics, geopolitics played a role in Mussolini's decision. It's still a very difficult history, and I think the blame ultimately falls on his lap. I think it does. So again, just a tough part of the war, ugly stuff, evil stuff, and there you go. So I guess to wrap it up, the grander point is, while Jews were targeted by the Nazi regime, so were other groups, right? So were Nazis. I'm not trying to dispel or minimize what happened to Jews, just pointing out that it happened to other groups just as well and just as brutal. There you have it. Once again, this is Mussolini, an Italian-American perspective, part 19. I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank, sign off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.